Welcome, folks, to another episode of the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. Matt and I are here today, and today we have a guest with us, Dr. Dan Morrical. He's a guest we've been talking of getting on for a while, ready to discuss some nutrition-related questions. Dan worked as an Iowa State sheep specialist for 33 years, where he was heavily involved with the sheep industry. He is currently working for Premier One Sheep Supplies as their production consultant to the sheep and goat producers via their Ask an Expert service. So, welcome, Dan. Glad to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to cover feeding corn silage, feeding haylage tonight. I currently work for Premier Sheep Supply in southeast Iowa, Washington, Iowa. I'm an Ask an Expert for them. When they bought out the Pipestone sheep supply business, they took on some nutritional products, and so they hired me on after I retired from Iowa State to be one of their experts, along with Dr. Geltz, who does the health part. So I worked at Iowa State for 33 years, grew up in Indiana on a small acreage, about 60 acres, worked on the hay racks, small square baling from the time I was 12 until basically I finished college. I had a younger brother that was 2 years younger than me, and it was about the same size. So we were in demand every day it was dry in Indiana all summer. So pitched a lot of manure on the weekends for farmers, built a lot of small squares. So I was at Iowa State as a sheep specialist, taught a sheep production class, oversaw our farms, and I've been with Premier now for 7 years. So when we think about feeding corn silage, can you feed corn silage to sheep? Yes. I've got two ways you can contact me. You can go through Ask an Expert at Premier via email. They'll send your questions on to me, and I'll get back to you within a day or two. Usually I get them done that day. And then I also work with 7 or 8 large sheep producers as a full-time consultant. They hire me for the year. 4 of those are currently feeding corn silage, and a couple are feeding baleage, and then Premier has fed baleage for about the last 15 years. So got some experience with that. In my opinion, there's no better way to harvest nutrients quicker, easier, more efficiently than corn silage. Because you got more nutrients harvested per acre. It's already pre-packaged, pre-processed, so you don't have to chop it up again. Just put it in the TMR wagon and go to it. Balanced for protein, some minerals, vitamins, and you've got a complete ration. So, but when we think about storing corn silage, to start with, I prefer bags, ag bags, just because you got a smaller face. It's easier to keep it fresh. I know it's going to cost you $10 or so a ton, but I think it's a better deal for most flocks because we aren't real big, unless we are also running cows or have other livestock, like a dairy operation where we're feeding more corn silage. So bags are my favorite, bunkers or uprights. If you still got an upright that works, that'll also be a good system. I do not like piling it all in the ground. 1, we get too much soil contamination. 2, we can't get it packed good enough. I have a client that I work with in Colorado that piles his corn silage on the ground, and I think it causes us a few problems, but it's still the cheapest way to feed sheep, and that's what he does. So he's running about 1,000 polypay in confinement. Next thing about corn silage is moisture content. Most of us are going to have it custom harvested. The custom harvester gets paid by the ton. So they are bad about wanting to cut it early. My goal is for corn silage to be at 40% dry matter. So dry. All of my clients on their corn silage test this fall, moisture level was 34 to 36%. So they're not getting it dry enough. In the dairy industry, they really push early immature corn silage. because they're trying to maximize intake of it, maximum nutrients per bite for those cows. That's why it goes through them like a screen door. But if you're paying for it by the ton, that extra moisture, that early maturity, it's making your corn silage cost 10%, maybe 20% more than it should. And it's going to be your big feed cost for the year. So let's get it drier. Shoot for 40. And if you get it to 35, you did okay. But 40 would be more ideal.
If you're not paying by ton, if you're putting it up yourself, is there a reason that you like it that dry? Because that seems really dry to what I'm used to with corn silage.
Okay. The benefit of having it really dry is you don't have to worry about intake problems. They'll eat more of it or can eat more. I've got one flock that, well, a couple of the flocks, both polypays, we're having trouble getting used to eat enough in late gestation.
Okay.
We're spiking it with corn. The Pipestone people use corn silage, and the Pipestone program there in Minnesota, Iowa, they quit using corn silage in late gestation because they feed those ewes outside. And in that cold weather with shorn ewes, they just won't stay outside long enough to eat enough. So they go to a more dense ration with alfalfa, dry hay, corn, and that way they get those ewes filled up fast before they get too cold and run back into the barn.
Interesting.
Just to explain, just so our listeners for sure understand, you're saying the reason late gestation you don't want high moisture, too high moisture, is because that ewe can only physically pack so much in her rumen. And when
That's
you have
right.
a high water content, you got a lot of water to groceries ratio, basically.
Right.
Same reason you can't be feeding first cutting stemmy hay to those ewes because there again they can't physically fit enough in there.
Yes, it doesn't digest fast enough. Corn silage is a water problem. When we think about a ewe's intake, she consumes about twice as much water as she does dry matter. Okay, normally. So if she eats 5 pounds of dry feed, she drink 10 pounds of water. Now, if she's lactating, she's going to produce even more water, drink more water, because she's shucking it out in the udder. And that's why on those really wet, washy spring pastures, the feed value is really good, but they just can't eat enough of that watery stuff to get enough nutrients into them to really gain one, because it's just so lush and so wet. The other problem we can get into, if that silage is too wet, we may have too much clostridial fermentation, and that can increase the production of butyric acid. And that might also impact intake or make those ewes back off on intake. So we definitely don't want it down in the 24, 26, 28% moisture. 35, I'll give you 35. If you can't take it any drier than 35, that's better than 32, because it's still 10% difference almost. So it's 10% cheaper. The next thing to think about on corn silage, obviously, it's half corn. So you got to start them easy because it's half corn. It's got plenty of phosphorus in most cases, so we probably aren't going to have to supplement phosphorus. We're going to have to supplement potassium. We probably are going to have to add calcium to that diet. It's probably the only macro mineral, maybe sulfur. Depending on how high your potassium levels are, you might have to add some more magnesium. And we're going to talk about potassium, I think, at the end if we have time. And then the other things to add, obviously, trace minerals. Corn silage is not going to be any different on your farm than the hay on your farm. If you've got a shortage of zinc and a shortage of selenium, it's going to be short in the corn silage just like it is in the hay. So basically, it's what's in the ground is what's in the plant, and we need to do those things. Trace minerals are cheap, so you got to get them in there at the right level as a way to do that. The next thing with corn silage is just volume off the face. I've already mentioned on the bags, feeding 6 inches a day keeps that face fresh, keeps it from spoiling. I did a research trial once with some corn stalks and wet distillers. We mixed it up and piled it on the floor in the feed room and fed off of it for a week. After about 3 weeks, we had a listeria outbreak, and I killed 8 of the 32 ewes. So that didn't work very good. And we thought maybe initially it was the wet distillers, and then come to find out when they harvested the corn stalks, they just flail chopped them into the forage box, and then left those forage boxes sit outside in the rain. And that stuff got pretty wet, and we had some funky stuff going on there with the corn or the corn stalks, and that's where our listeria came from. The other thing to do, you want to try to get that silage chopped as fine as possible. Make sure that recutter is turned down as tight as you can get it. The smaller the particle size, the tighter you can pack it, the more fermentation quality is better. Less sorting I'll have feeding it out, because we all know that ewes and goats both are really good at selecting. They can leave every piece of cob in the bunk if you don't force them to clean it up or you don't get it broken up enough. So we want to chop fine. That makes the custom harvester go slower. They don't like that. They may charge you a little more, but it's okay. It's worth the money. Inoculants on silage. I'm not familiar with the inoculants. I'd say if I was going into a pile, I definitely would probably put an inoculation on it. I think if you want to think about that, talk to some silage experts besides me on whether or not there's enough benefits of that in that regard to make it worthwhile. The next thing relative to corn silage would be with listeria. That's probably the most common worry that everybody has. Obviously, when you're piling it on the ground and you try to scoop it up to put it in the TMR wagon, you'll get into more dirt contamination, and that gets your listeria count up. The other thing we can think about on corn silage, dirt splashing up on that lower stalk, so you might cut it a few inches higher on the stalk, leave that dirty stuff in the field. Same way on if we're in a drought situation and you got cheap corn silage now because of drought. Yeah. Chop that stuff a little higher because the nitrates tend to be lower to the ground. And you can leave some of that nitrate in the field and not have to worry about it when you feed it out to the ewes.
On that listeria question, do you think there's any more danger with listeria with feeding corn silage in a TMR ration as compared to feeding wet baleage like whole bales? Like, what's your experience with it? Do you see more cases with like wet baleage, feeding a whole bale versus feeding corn silage in a TMR ration?
I think if you do your due diligence with either, the risks are pretty low.
Mm-hmm.
We've had some listeria at Premier on big ground bales of baleage. You poke the hole in it when you move it to the feeding area, don't notice it, and that bale goes bad, put it in there, and now all of a sudden you got some listeria problems. Maybe the worst 2 cases of listeria I've seen in my career. We had a producer that was using his front end loader to pick up corn stalk bales and put them in the tub grinder, and was getting a lot of dirt when he was picking those bales up. So basically, he's force feeding dirt to his ewes. He had a problem with listeria until he bought his bale fork and could put up cleaner, pick up less of the gunk at the bottom. The other worst case scenario I saw in my career was a lamb feedlot. This is a veterinarian feeding lambs. He had 300 lambs on feed, middle of the summer. His hay straw barn was empty. He fed up all of his straw bales, used them all up. So he opened that up to give the lambs more shade. And they went in there and they'd been on a whole corn pelleted protein diet, so no roughage. And they went in there and devoured all that stuff that was on the ground, whether it was rotten or not. And he killed half of his lambs with listeria. It took about 3 months, but he got half of them. And the problem with listeria is there's not a good treatment. successfully. You gotta really pump antibiotics into them. You got to get it across the blood-brain barrier. It's not very fruitful. So the best thing to do is just avoid it from the get-go. And that's why I don't like putting it on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on corn silage?
Well, while we're on that, let's.
Well, I would like to hear a little bit more at some point, and maybe we can go into it later on how you go about balancing rations using corn silage. Because I think when I'm talking to other producers, that's my top concerns. A lot of guys want to feed corn silage. They have corn silage. Maybe they feed some cattle, whatever, but they don't want to balance rations. They just want a number that of corn silage that they can feed their ewes.
Let's do, that's kind of like the guys that don't want to give mineral to their sheep or salt. And there's some of those out there. So when we think about balancing for corn silage diets, it's 8% crude protein.
Yep.
So it needs protein supplementation. You can do that with soybean meal. You can do that with distillers. You can do it with alfalfa hay. And alfalfa hay might be the best because that also gets our calcium in there as well. So we kill two birds with one stone. And I've got some clients that are using corn silage and dry alfalfa hay, get along really good. And then the clients that are having trouble with intake are trying to use a really wet alfalfa haylage, like 25, 28% moisture, because it just wouldn't quit raining. And then they finally just said, we got to get this stuff bagged or we're not going to have anything to feed. So, and it's not very good stuff. So it's got decent protein, but the sheep don't seem to be eating it. So we're trying to figure that little quandary out right now. So protein, ewes need about a 10, 11, 12% protein diet, give or take. In early mid-gestation, lactation, I can feed them 15%. I don't use crude protein. We'll talk about this right now. I was going to talk about it later and actually forgot, but the new NRC for sheep and goats came out in 2007.
Yep.
So it's not new anymore. Guess how many people have adapted software to the new NRC? There's only one, and that's me and another colleague of mine at Iowa State University, Garland Dulkey, who's also a PhD nutritionist, works in the Beef Center. So we sell a sheep software Excel spreadsheet. Costs you $100. You can get it online, so you don't have to wait for it to come in the mail. It's through the extension store. If you look under the extension publications, under the extension store, sheep brands. And brands, they came with the acronym is for beef ration and nutrition decision software. So we have sheep brands. We don't tell them the rest of it. So
that's on the Iowa State website.
Iowa State University website. Yes. Yeah. Under extension.
I'll put a link. I'll put a link in the show notes to that.
Okay. Very good. If you can't find it, I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Very good. So that to me is the best software out there. It uses metabolizable protein. It uses net energy rather than TDN, which is a bad estimate of energy content.
That was going to be a question for you.
Okay, so we got that covered.
Do you use TDN or what energy?
Net energy.
Net energy. Okay.
And then it's got all the trace minerals as well. It's the only software that has trace minerals in it. And if we think about feeding sheep, obviously we know selenium is the number one trace mineral to worry about. And in reality, the most common one is zinc.
Yeah.
But usually the supplements, minerals have enough zinc in them, it's okay. So zinc, iodine, selenium are all short usually. Copper's too much in most cases. Or let's put it with maybe not too much, but it's adequate so we don't need to add anymore. And when we get into Iowa with all of our pig feed, we get contamination and then we get into copper poisoning. So sheep don't like copper, but they do need some copper, just not very much. Okay, so that's the brands. That's a great software package. It's worth the money. If you get that bought, try to use it. You can contact me. I'll help you walk through it, fix problems. Some things, it's a plug and chug. It's not an automatic solver. It's not that fancy. It's only worth $100. Like the software that the feed mills use, that's $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for that software. So I know sheep people are too cheap. We had something that high, nobody'd ever buy. So,
Yeah.
That cover what you want on balancing?
I think so. Yeah. Yep. I just wanted to emphasize the need to balance rations rather than just
Yes, it's not a perfect
some
feed, so
silage up.
you've got to help add some things in. Okay.
Yep.
All right. I think we'll move on then to haylage, baleage. I've got two clients again that are on haylage, wheatlage. I have one guy in Missouri that's got his cover crops is all wheat, and he's got tons of baleage, wheatlage that he's going to feed. He's currently only got 200 ewes, but he's got lots of facilities. He's reverting from finishing pigs that are basically shot into sheep barns, and so he's looking to grow his sheep and feed wheatlage. So again, going back to moisture targets on wheatlage or on baleage, we want to be at 40% dry matter at least, and I'd prefer it to be 50. When we fed baleage full feed at Premier on our hair ewes, they could eat too much and they got too fat. So if you're going to feed big round bales of baleage and just unlimited intake, you're going to have obesity, you're going to have vaginal prolapses, you're going to have big lambs. You're not going to be happy. Now, I love baleage. You don't have near the feed out waste because everything's more tasty. It's in a recutter on your baler, ideally, so you can get that bale packed tighter, so you can do a better job of getting it wrapped, getting it sealed, getting it to ferment. You'll increase your nutrient quality of what you have you feed the ewes, I'd say at least 10%. So 10% more protein. So if your alfalfa hay would be 18, in the baleage form, it's going to be 20, 21. On straight grass hay, grass baleage, grass, legume, cross, we're getting 15, 16% all the time at Premier. But because it's baleage, you don't need as big a harvest window, so we get it cut when we should, rather than when it looks like it's going to be dry for 10 days, and that's usually about the middle of June, and we're way past prime nutrient value. So then we have problems with intake and extra waste and sorting and whatnot. And then not only do you get more because you don't lose the leaves as much because it's not as dry when you put it up, unless you're trying to chop into the harvest box when it's blowing 30 mile an hour and half of it misses the silage wagon, but that's okay. And then I think the other part about it is we have less storage loss. My most biggest pet peeve is people that mismanage, mishandle big round bales stored outside. I think we're giving up a third of our hay crop. It gets damaged. It rots into the ground.
It's only the first 4 inches that are bad, you know?
Yes, on the bottom, on the top, on the sides.
Yeah,
and
but
where do many people stick it? They put it right in along the fence row along the trees. So it helps catch more snow. It never gets any sunshine. It never gets dried out. So net wrap for sure. That's the first step on bales, which is not part of tonight's talk, but net wrap. Get it up on tires, pallets, rock, telephone poles. Store it inside would be the smartest thing you ever did. It'll save you a lot on feed, but you're still going to lose, even stored inside our small square bales. Okay. I know those bales weigh 10 pounds less coming out of the barn when we feed them than they did going in. And it's not all moisture loss. It's respiration nutrients breaking down, loss of protein, lots of energy, lots of volatile fatty acids. So that hay is less nutrient dense when we feed it. And that's biology, and we can't fix that. Now, when we put it in a wrap it and silage, we tend to keep all that stuff inside that bale so it doesn't get away from us. So one of the problems that we've had with baleage is it tends to be very high in soluble nitrogen, which may be getting too deep in the weeds for this group. But basically, when we think about feeding a 16, 18, 20% baleage product, the bacteria don't need that much protein, right? They probably need 11, 12, 13% protein to have enough nitrogen in the rumen to feed the bacteria.
For gut bacteria.
Yes, the rumen bacteria have maximum microbial growth and yield. Because the more growth of bacteria we have that grow and die and pass down the gut to the small intestine, where the microbial or bacterial protein that are in the rumen are digested by the small intestine, and then the sheep live off that protein. And it's a really high quality protein. So all that extra nitrogen from 13% up to 18% or 22%, that's got to be excreted. So it solubilizes in the rumen, gets absorbed into the bloodstream, gets converted, and then excreted out through the urine. And we wonder why our barns smell like ammonia when we're feeding alfalfa hay. It's because the ewes are urinating all that extra nitrogen or ammonia in their urine. So as we think about that, baleage is a great feed. Again, it's not going to be any different mineral-wise maybe than the dry hay version, but it will tend to be higher in protein, higher energy, more energy dense. So instead of 55% TDN hay, you might be at 60% TDN on haylage because it's got more leaves still there, because you didn't let it get too dry, didn't rake it 6 times, didn't get rained on. Hopefully you cut it maybe a little more immature, so it's not as got as much fiber there that can't be digested. So it's a little more energy dense feed. Okay, let's see. So anyway, the soluble nitrogen, what that can do to us is it can mess up blood pH, which can mess up calcium metabolism in the blood, and therefore we get into some more milk fevers, potentially. And this is more of a problem in dairy cows than in sheep. But those of us that have been selecting ewes based off of EPDs for milk, we've got highly prolific flocks, ewes raising 2, 3, and 4 lambs, where their milk production is way up there. And I would say it's just like a Holstein cow on a metabolic body size or per 100 weight of body weight. They're producing 8, 10, 12 pounds of milk. So they're just kind of like a Holstein cow. So milk fevers are a higher risks for us. Potentially with the soluble nitrogen, the easiest way to fix it is to feed some dry hay instead of baleage. If that's been a problem or is a problem. To me, it's always difficult to know, does that ewe have ketosis in late gestation, or does she have milk fever? Mm-hmm. And here's the way we can tell. There's 2 diagnostics for a ewe with milk fever or hypocalcemia. One is her ears are cold. And 2, if you do a dilation test, her pupils do not contract as fast as normal with milk fever or calcium problems. I just treat them for both and hope I get them better.
I usually treat for milk fever first. If they're not up in a half hour, I know it probably wasn't that. If it is milk fever, what was that?
Are you IVing them? No. Where should you shoot that juice?
I do it sub Q.
Okay. How many cc's you put in into them?
I put in 100 to 150 cc's the first time.
Okay. Caldex?
23% the calcium glutamate.
Calcium glutamate. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Here's what I'm going to tell you I would do.
All right.
I would get behind the U, left side, right?
Yep.
When you're standing behind her, between the last rib to the hip bone, and you got that V kind of in there. Okay.
Yep.
So in the center of that V where it's indented, so below her loin edge, I would inject it right into her body cavity.
Gotcha. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Sub Q is better than an IM, but I like IP. Okay. Intraperitoneal.
Sub Q is probably going to be a slower response to get it into the U. Is that correct, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
If you want a quick response, IV her. Put it in her vein.
Yeah.
If you do it too fast, you'll kill her.
Yep. Yep.
So most sheep people aren't doing that. It's too hard to find the vein on all that wool.
Yeah.
I can bleed sheep. I can stick sheep because on my graduate work, I had a full-time job and we bled ewes every day, and they were debelays. So they were fine wool sheep, and they had wrinkles and wool. So it was hard to find that juggler. But I got really good at it.
Question before we move on, you were talking about feeding haylage with high nitrates, or was it the high
corn silage?
No. You were talking about really potent haylage might have
soluble nitrogen.
Yeah.
Too much soluble nitrogen.
Yeah. If we were to mix that, so say that's an alfalfa baleage and we're mixing it with corn silage, that would be a good way to dilute that, correct?
Yes.
Or is dry hay better?
The other part about it is, when you think about it, when you put the corn silage in there, you're putting the corn in there. So now we got lots of energy for the bugs. Yeah. And we got the nitrogen from the alfalfa, and they go together and they can make lots of bacterial protein.
And we have good calcium as well.
Yes, and you got plenty of calcium.
Yeah.
As long as it's not too wet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So you mentioned the thing of milk fever problems. How late in gestation do you have to really pay attention to that?
What I've seen on milk fevers is it's in the last week.
Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe, but how soon before that do you need to start watching your ration?
A couple weeks. So, yeah. And if I was a dairy nutritionist and this was a dairy meeting, we'd talk about feeding low calcium diets to try to get that cow fired up to be absorbing calcium out of her skeleton, so that once she calves, then we can put her on a high calcium diet. She's got her parathyroid hormones flying, trying to get all the calcium she can get absorbed. And then we feed her a high calcium diet and we get away from milk fevers. Milk fevers in the dairy business are bad deal. It's bad nutrition. Part of that is the cation anion balance. Again, too much soluble nitrogen and too much potassium, which is what we're going to talk about at the end. Mm-hmm. And we get on these alfalfa hays. I've seen some as high as 3% potassium.
Yep.
Too much potassium.
So I have some dairy background. I was always a little confused why we wanted to feed that cow a low calcium ration. But what should I be doing so that my ewes have enough adequate calcium coming up to that late gestation? It seemed backwards to me.
Yes, and in general, we do not feed low calcium diets to sheep. I want to make sure I feed lots of calcium. So that would be where I would start. Also need to feed enough phosphorus, because you could be short on phosphorus as well. Then I want to make sure I got enough vitamin D in the ration, which normally on dry hay is not a problem because dry hay is a really good source of vitamin D. But if your hay's 2 years old, it's been in the barn for 2 years. Because last year we had a drought, and you didn't get any hay put up, so you're feeding it 2 years ago. There's not hardly any vitamins left in that stuff. So make sure they got enough vitamin D. Then we can worry about, if we want to, the cation-anion imbalance, which is basically the ratio of sodium and potassium to chlorine and sulfur. Sulfur is a negative ion, chlorine's a negative ion, sodium and potassium are positive ions. And we need to get that ration on that, what they call the DICAD balance, down around 0, ideally. In the dairy world, they feed ammonium chloride. Pump a lot of chlorine into those cows. Okay? Salt's got chlorine in it, but it's also got sodium, so that doesn't do us any good. If you need to feed calcium, you're on corn silage diet. With grass hay, you could use calcium sulfate as your calcium source, and then you're getting sulfur into them plus calcium. So it would help with the anion-cation balance.
So that late gestation, when I want to make sure that I have adequate calcium, adding dical would be better than just pulverized limestone.
No, because you're worried about calcium. And dical has got calcium and phosphorus, right?
Yep.
Dical's 3 times, 4 times, 5 times more expensive than limestone.
So then doing the pulverized limestone is the better route.
It's good enough, okay?
Yeah.
Now, it may not be as absorbable as calcium sulfate, because part of it is how the ewe is set up. If she's been on a short or long calcium diet, so her efficiency of calcium absorption is not running full bore, whereas that's what they try to do in the dairy cow, is feed them a deficient diet so that they are trying to absorb every stitch of calcium out of the diet and mobilizing bones. And then they've got those 2 things running. And then as soon as they calve, they flip them into the lactation diet, which is high calcium, and they got lots of calcium intake.
Yep.
And sheep are not as good as cow, or no, let's not reset. Sheep are better than dairy cow. Dairy cows, in my opinion, today are a metabolic wreck waiting to happen, because we bred them to be so productive without increasing their capacity to eat more. There's only so much a 1,500-pound dairy cow can eat. And she just can't stuff enough groceries through her to maintain body condition, whatnot. We've pushed yield too high on the dairy cows. Okay. We're getting close to time. Let's go to potassium real quick. I got a couple of things to think about with that. When we think about potassium, high potassium diets are going to increase our need for more magnesium in the diet, because high potassium will, i.e. grass tetany, will cause a shortage of magnesium. So magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salts, is something you could feed. Now, I don't think we can afford to buy Epsom salts from the local pharmacy, but if you get caught short, you need some real quick, go buy Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate, add that in so you can get your magnesium level up. On sulfur, the brand software is set such that we want a ratio of nitrogen to sulfur of 10:1 so that we get maximum microbial yield. If we don't have enough sulfur, we don't get enough sulfur amino acids made by the microbes. And in most cases, sulfur is short on most sheep diets for the percent of nitrogen in the diet, because we tend to overfeed nitrogen to these ewes on these high alfalfa hay, high legume diets, or even pastures. Spring pastures are 15, 18, 20% nitrogen. We don't want excess sulfur. I don't know how relevant how widespread distillers are in your country. They can be high in sulfur. As long as we're below 0.4% sulfur, we're probably okay. But high sulfur can decrease selenium and copper absorption. So we've had some problems at a flock in Kansas. He had a lot of baby lambs with white mussel disease, and he was feeding distillers because it was back when it first kicked in. Nobody wanted it. It was extremely cheap. He was feeding like a diet that was half solid, half wet distillers. And all that high sulfur was screwing up his selenium absorption. And he had white mussel in his baby lambs. Potassium, I try to keep it below 3%. You shouldn't have too much trouble. That's our target. I think.
So as long
again,
as long as you're below 3%, you don't worry about it. Because I've been trying to stay even lower than that on gestating ewes, and it's on a theory, but I think I'm seeing less. I don't, like I said, this is a theory, but I think I'm seeing less mastitis issues at freshening, which had been an issue for us in the past.
Okay.
So this was a question I really wanted to ask, is on the potassium thing, just because I don't hear much about it.
Right. And we generally don't worry about potassium. You know, I haven't figured out, nobody's figured out all these hard bag ewes. Yeah. Everybody says, oh, it's OPP. Well, no, it's not. Not every hard bag's OPP. A lot of them may be, but I think some of those minerals like that, excess potassium, could be screwing up with the cation anion balance. And therefore, we've got way too negative a dicad, and it's screwing up mineral balance in the blood, which may screw up milk production, or it causes inflammation, some of those things, and so we're not getting good milk flow out of those ewes.
Yeah.
And obviously, they only need 0.6% potassium.
Right.
So you're feeding 4, 5, 6 times what they need. Well, it's not one of those cases, some's good, more is better. You can get too much.
Yeah.
So I think the key is all these alfalfa growers may be putting out too much potassium on the ground. And I just read, when I was getting ready for this talk tonight, there was a guy talking about potassium balance on corn acres. 200 bushel of corn only takes off about 50 pounds of potassium. And we're putting in 90 or 100. Because we're not counting the breakdown from the stalk part that's available the next year. So we're probably overdoing potassium on our row crops as well, or could be. So 3 to 6.6 and 3 are way different.
I know that's for the dairy guys, that's a big thing in our area, is lower potassium diets for dry cows. Now, in our area, a lot of these acres are getting a lot of manure. And that's where I think a lot of our high potassium is coming from, is from fields that are getting a lot of manure. Because we're not, as a whole, in our area, we don't put a lot of potassium on as a fertilizer.
Right.
And the cash croppers obviously will have to, but I think where a lot of this high potassium where a lot of these high potassium feeds are coming from is actually from good manure history.
Maybe not good.
Well, manure history.
There we go. There we go.
Maybe a little too much.
Yes.
But I'm just, as we're talking, I'm flipping through my feed analysis tests here and looking at, I mean, my alfalfa is usually always up in that 3% potassium, give or take a little bit, sometimes over. But we'll get alfalfa grass hay. If we make it young, that'll be up over 3%.
Yes.
And the alfalfa, like pure, we're rarely feeding pure alfalfa straight. So that's, if we're diluting it with corn silage, it's really not an issue. Where I think we really see an issue is guys making young alfalfa grass mixes and feeding that as a complete feed.
So as the main only roughage.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
too good.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So they need to feed some corn stalks with it.
There you
Feed
go.
wheat straw with it. Oat straw.
Yeah.
Oat hay.
Yeah.
So Matt,
But
you're at over a 3%. I was just looking at some of my last analysis.
Yeah,
Looks like
on most times on our alfalfa, it'll be some of it'll be over, some will be a tick below. Depends, what maturity it was when we made it, so forth. But yeah, yep, yeah. So
I
do
have
you, yeah. Is that something you watch for a lot when you're balancing rations? Or you're just kind of, as long as we're below 3%, we're not probably not doing any harm. And from the little bit of research I did, nobody really seems to know what excess potassium is going to cause.
I think you're exactly right. If you go by the dairy world, it's going to be more milk fevers, which I think is a possibility. I try to balance it. If I've got a flock I'm dealing with and they've got milk fevers, I kick the calcium up to start with. And, then I look at calcium and they're feeding twice what the ewe needs, supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a shortage of calcium.
Yep.
Then you look at the dicad and it's really messed up because it's too much potassium.
Yeah.
So then I'll add in magnesium sulfate and I'll add in calcium sulfate and I'll, if I need calcium, and I'll add in ammonium chloride.
Yeah.
To try to get that dicad back closer to 0.
And you're using the sulfate products because you want to up the sulfur too.
And I generally need sulfur to begin with, so that I get a double bonus.
Yeah.
And I don't expect anybody to do this longhand, which is why spend the $100 and buy brands.
Yeah.
Or convince Matt to buy the brands for $100 and let him do your rations. Or if you're real cheap, like most sheep people, send a question in to ask an expert and say, I heard Dr. Dan, I need help with my rations. And Dr. Dan will get back to him and we can run it through brands and see where we're at.
Yep. It sounds like a good plan.
And just so you know, the first thing Dan will ask you is, do you have a forage test? And if you say no, then Dr. Dan really doesn't feel very comfortable trying to fix your problem because I don't know what you're feeding. Neither do you.
Right.
I'm very glad you brought that up because I think it's important when you're feeding dry hay. But I think it's especially important when we start feeding things like corn silage and haylage, where it's a lot more of a potent feed and it can vary a whole lot more. So I'm really glad you brought that up about the needing a forage test.
It's a shot in the dark. I mean, just for an
It's like
example.
the blind leading the blind.
Yeah.
Yeah. A guy called me and it had to do with the universal feeders. He was wanting to know, he's new to sheep. He's wondering how much grain he should be giving his ewes. And well, of course, it's the old standby. Well, it depends. Like, when are they due to lamb and what kind of hay are you feeding? Well, he tries to describe the hay to me, and this is no fault of his, but what I call good quality second cutting and what somebody else, you can't put a number on it.
You
There's
can't.
no way.
It's called a forage test.
Well,
and
that's the
and
number.
they're cheap, $15, $20.
Yeah.
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 It's a great investment. Now, the challenge is for most people is they don't have a bale core. So trying to find a coring system to get a good sample, because you can't just go grab a hunk. You got to get a good sample. and that means sampling 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 bales, not grab something and throw it in a sack and send it in.
Since you brought that up, do you have a core sampler that you prefer? Because that's a pet peeve of mine, is finding a core sample that does a good job in pulling samples out of baleage.
Nope, sorry. I only talk about it and I don't do it.
I have one I really like, Matt.
Okay, well you'll have to send me a link, because I'm the one I like, but the one I have, I keep cutting grooves on and try to sharpen it. It's a real pain. Dry hay is easy, but baleage is hard.
I used to, no, I did dry and baleage with this thing. I haven't had it very long, but you put it on a drill, and
Yeah,
you there's a little compartment on the back that you use a rubber band and put your Ziploc, put your bag over, and it
yeah.
you drill in, then run your plunger through it, and it pushes it right into the bag.
Yeah, but how easy does it drill in? And once you do a 100 bales, does it still go in?
Okay, I got the
Well,
solution for you.
Yep.
Okay, buy a wool bale core. They're bigger diameter. They're like an inch in diameter.
Okay.
It has a serrated edge on the point that you can replace. So look at the bale cores, and obviously that operates off of a drill as well. So
Yep.
it takes a bigger sample. It's going to take a bigger drill, but it might work better because you can change out that serrated leading edge.
What did you call it?
A wool core.
A wool.
WOOL. Wool. Haven't talked about that all night.
oh, this is to take a sample out of a bale of wool.
Yes.
I
And you
gotcha.
think cutting alfalfa is tough?
Hmm.
Those packed wool bales are nasty.
I might have to try that. I
See
will
what you can see what you can find.
I think there's some bale samplers that you can change the tips on.
Yeah, there is, but it's still just cutting through that stuff is hard. And I'm complaining, and I tried one sampler and used it for a number of years and don't really like it. So I haven't exactly gone out and tried a whole bunch, but I was hoping
You know why
someone.
that is, Matt?
What's
Because
that?
you're too cheap to buy another one.
I'm cheap. Exactly. We've talked about that. I'm a sheep farmer. I'm cheap. I spend $100
What's a
on.
bale core cost?
I probably spend $100 on this one. It ought to last me 10 years.
What is your time worth? I am $100 an hour.
Yeah. All right, I'll try a new one. We'll do a podcast on we'll do a whole podcast on which bale core works best.
Okay.
All
Yeah.
right.
I'll have
Anything
to
else
look.
I didn't cover?
Well, there's probably a lot more we could talk about, but I think that went over what we had on the agenda pretty good for tonight. What do you got, Liam?
Hey, that was a good discussion. Very interesting. So, yeah,
So
thanks a
again,
lot.
if you want to contact me, just go through Premier Ask an Expert. That'll get a hold of me.
All right, I'll put a link to your page, your Premiere page,
Thank you.
on the show notes, so people should be able to find you. So, yeah, thanks again for coming on and taking a look at this TMR baleage and corn silage subject. Appreciate it.
I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure we'll have you on more for other topics as well. I'm sure there's quite a few others that we could get into. So, but really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening, folks, to another episode of the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. Want to take the opportunity to wish you all a wonderful Thanksgiving weekend, and don't forget to sample your forage. Stay tuned for another episode. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Stay tuned for another episode. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again for listening, folks, to another episode of the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. I'd like to just take the opportunity on behalf of the Lost Creek Wholesale team and the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. We wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. It's that time of the year when folks are thinking about putting their livestock back into the barn for the winter. If you're in need of any hay racks, feeders, lambing pens, we got it. Give us a call here at Lost Creek Wholesale and we'd be happy to help you out. If you got any topics or discussions you'd like to hear more about, feel free to give me a call at 717-310-3641 or drop me an email at leon@lostcreekwholesale.net. Also, if you have a hay core sampler that you really like and you want to share it with our listeners, send me an email and let me know what you have and why you like it. Thanks again, and we'll see you folks next time.